I'm on my way home. Reassuring words that usually bring comfort, a smile, and the quiet joy of an impending arrival. But when that promised arrival never comes, a simple check in turns into 25 years of pleas and prayers for their safe return. Today, we will be taking a look at the disappearance of Shelton Sanders, which took place in Columbia, South Carolina in June of 2001. But if you're new here, hi, my name is Devin, and welcome to Kept on Ice, a true crime podcast where we focus on cold and unsolved cases. If you find cases like this interesting, please consider subscribing or following this podcast. Shelton Sanders was born on August 31st, 1975, in Rembert, South Carolina, to his parents, William and Peggy Sanders. Shelton was described by those who knew him as inspiring, humble, and an outgoing role model who, quote, was a family man at heart, end quote. He was described as the most inspiring person his friends had ever met. He was a huge Dallas Cowboys fan and was the primary organizer for community cookouts and group day trips to the beach. His younger sister, Wilveria, remembers him as a mentor and father figure who taught her everything from cooking to karate. From as young as 6 years old, Shelton's family noticed that he had a natural curiosity about him, and his family wondered if his inquisitive nature would lead to him becoming a scientist. Shelton's father even stated, quote, he was my right hand, even at 12 years old. He liked to study and he liked to do things right, end quote. And when Shelton's family says that he liked to study, they were not kidding, as Shelton has also been described as a star student with a deep fascination in technology and computers. But these weren't Shelton's only interests. He was heavily involved in his community and various organizations. For high school, he attended Hillcrest High School, where he was also active in the school community, playing snare drums in the marching band and playing 2 seasons of JV football. But by the time he had hit his late teens, a clear interest took center stage. He had become deeply, quote, enamored with computers, end quote. Now, remember, Shelton grew up in the 80s and 90s. And this is a period when technology, especially computer technology, is rapidly evolving. And Shelton couldn't wait to be part of that evolution. And this passion further translated into his academic career, as after graduating from Hillcrest High School in 1994, he attended the University of South Carolina and majored in administrative information management with a focus in IT. And just like in high school, Shelton excelled in college as well, maintaining a 3.5 GPA and earning a reputation amongst his friends as a, quote, computer guru, end quote. However, his academic journey was sadly interrupted between 1996 and 1998 when Shelton suffered third-degree burns from a yard accident while burning leaves. Reportedly, heavy winds turned the fire towards Sheldon and he caught fire. Despite this setback, which kept him out of school for over a year, Shelton returned to college to maintain his 3.5 GPA and earned multiple awards for his leadership skills. And all the work that Shelton had done to get back into school was rewarded when, even before completing his degree, Shelton accepted a professional position in 1999 while he was still a student. And he began working as a computer systems manager for the USC School of Medicine's neuropsychiatry department. But Shelton had long-term goals far beyond working at USC. According to his personal website, he had plans to work for a company for 3 years. This was before he accepted his job at USC, so it's just kind of generally a company, and then start and run his own computer company. Some of his personal goals included looking forward to getting married and having children, and he dreamed of one day owning a ranch and raising and distributing cattle. And all of this background leads us to the night of June 19th, 2001. Now, some important context here. Shelton had actually been chosen to be the best man at a high school friend of his wedding that was coming up in a few months. So, on that Tuesday, Shelton, who is 25 years old at the time, was in Columbia for school and work. And after he finished his shift, he met up with his friend and former roommate, a man named Mark Richardson. Reportedly, the pair went out to scout out hotel rooms for the upcoming bachelor party they were hosting. At 9 p.m., Shelton called his mother, Peggy, and let her know that he would be home in about 2 hours. Between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., Shelton and Mark were seen at several downtown Columbia hotels, including the Wellesley Inn and the Embassy Suites. According to Mark, both he and Shelton returned to his home on Olympia Avenue to finalize the bachelor party details. And then Shelton left to drive the 40 miles back to his parents' house in Rembert. Back in Rembert, Shelton's father, William, reported that at roughly 11:45 p.m., he was awakened by a nightmare in which he heard Shelton screaming for help and then heard multiple gunshots. That night, he stayed up waiting for Shelton to come home, but he never did. When Shelton hadn't arrived by the early morning, the family immediately knew something was very wrong. Shelton was an incredibly reliable person who would never not come home and not say anything. And then Shelton's family began calling his cell phone and it went straight to voicemail. William then took it upon himself to call multiple hospitals and the highway patrol to check and see if there had been any potential car accidents. But again, nothing led to Shelton. And that same day, June 20th, 2001, Shelton's family went to the police department to formally report Shelton missing. Initially, police told the family that they had to wait 48 hours before they could formally report Shelton missing because he was an adult. However, the family refused to wait for the police and instead organized their own search to begin immediately looking for him and began driving the highways he would have used to return home from Columbia. Shelton's father specifically continued these searches after work and would be out looking for his son for hours, sometimes until 2 in the morning. But finally, after 48 hours and no word from Shelton, police acknowledged that Shelton may not have left of his own volition, and the family finally got police reinforcement behind their search. Authorities also began checking hospitals, monitoring Shelton's bank accounts and credit card activity, of which there was none, and even used a helicopter to search the terrain between Sumter and Richland County. They even searched the Wateree and Conagry rivers based on anonymous tips. And even with all this searching, nobody had seen Shelton. Within the first week of the search, Shelton's brother Edwin began calling some of Shelton's friends to see if they had seen or heard from Shelton since June 19th. And he quickly discovers that Shelton had been spending the evening with Mark Richardson looking at hotel rooms for an upcoming bachelor party. And of course, the family begins reaching out to the last person who saw Shelton, Mark Richardson. But when Shelton's family first reaches out to Mark, he was described as, quote, really defensive, end quote, and even, quote, berserk, end quote, reportedly asking multiple times, quote, why is everybody calling me, end quote, which, sir, you are the last person to have seen a now missing person. So yeah, we would like to talk to you. 1 week after Shelton's disappearance on June 26th, Mark finally agrees to speak to Shelton's family at their home and tell them what he knew. While at the house, investigators separated Mark from the family after the initial confrontation to conduct their own, quote, separate conversation, end quote, which is not an interrogation apparently, with him. During this conversation, Mark claims that he and Shelton parted ways between 11 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. after Shelton dropped him off at home on June 19th. Other investigators who were present during this conversation noted that Mark appeared, quote, nervous and defensive, end quote, and repeatedly asked investigators if he was a suspect. When police asked if they could take a look around Mark's home, he told them, quote, "You can look, but you can't search," end quote, and advised them, quote, "not to come back without a warrant," end quote, which is his constitutional right. So the police go and obtain a search warrant for his home. After obtaining the search warrant for the home, police return to the residence, specifically looking for a firearm. And during their search, police recover a Glock 45 caliber handgun. Though they didn't explicitly tell him at the time, Mark was quickly becoming a person of interest in the disappearance of Shelton Sanders, even if he wasn't yet a full-blown suspect. And officers began taking a closer look into Mark's movements on the night Shelton went missing. And when they do, they find something very interesting. Sumter County investigators interviewed Mark's neighbors, and one of those neighbors tells police that they heard gunshots shortly before midnight on June 19th. When the neighbor went outside to check what was going on, they actually saw Mark, who told him, quote, "Don't worry about that. That was my car backfiring," end quote. Despite the early leads in the case, the investigation would become stalled over fights within multiple police departments. The Sumter County and Richland County Sheriff's Departments began arguing over which agency had jurisdiction over the investigation. Reportedly, Shelton's family had actually expressed frustration with the Sumter County Sheriff's Department, alleging they, quote, "dropped the ball," end quote, by losing materials and mistakenly focusing on a drug-related theory that didn't align with who Shelton was as a person at all. And as the months passed, this case ran cold, and media coverage virtually disappeared. And Shelton's little sister, Wilveria, who was only 11 years old at the time of his disappearance, described this time as one of deep trauma. She recalls hearing her mother crying and praying into the late hours of the night, while her father became increasingly weighed down by the lack of progress in this case. And the case went cold for nearly 2 years. That is until April 26, 2003, when a Richland County deputy responded to a noise complaint at the Greenbrier Apartments in Columbia. There, they found Shelton's white Oldsmobile Regency backed into a random parking spot. The car's tires were flat, its fluids had leaked onto the pavement, and authorities determined that it had likely been sitting there since the night of Shelton's disappearance. And when police searched the car, they find nothing. No fingerprints and no DNA. And though no physical evidence was found inside the car, this discovery reignites the investigation, and police begin to take another look at Shelton's disappearance. Once the Richland County Sheriff's Department took over the case, they began to analyze local cell tower records and specifically compare that data to the original person of interest, Mark Richardson. Sergeant Kevin Baker was responsible for identifying Mark Richardson's phone activity, which were then used to triangulate Mark's location on June 19th and June 20th. These records revealed that shortly after midnight on the night Shelton went missing, Mark's phone pinged off a cell tower in, quote, "very close proximity," end quote, to the Greenbrier Apartments where the car was found. And shortly after this discovery, Mark Richardson is brought in for questioning by the Richland County Sheriff's Department. And the investigation began to shift from a missing persons investigation to a murder investigation, with Mark Richardson as the prime suspect. During this 2003 interrogation, investigators confronted Mark with the cell tower records that triangulated his location at the Greenbrier Apartments shortly after midnight on the night Shelton disappeared. And this is important because Mark had previously stated that Shelton dropped him off back home. So, what are you doing at the Greenbrier Apartments an hour after you claimed you were dropped off at home? And these records show Mark's phone, at least, near where Shelton's car was found. When confronted with the cell phone data, Mark told investigators that he was actually meeting up with a prostitute who had picked him up and drove him to a location near the apartments in order to exchange her goods and services. And Mark even provided investigators with the name of the woman he allegedly met that night. However, Sergeant Baker found this story completely improbable after doing some investigation, and Sergeant McDaniels later noted that it was not common practice for ladies of the night to go pick up their clients in their own personal vehicles. That's just not usually how that transaction works. Nonetheless, investigators spent time trying to verify Mark's alibi. And for reasons that I do not know or understand, the case would stall for 2 more years. However, after completely ruling out Mark's alibi, investigators would bring him in again for questioning in mid 2005. If you're keeping up, this is now the third time we have spoken to Mark over the course of 4 years, and we still don't know where Shelton is. During this interrogation, police again confront him with the cell tower data, but this time they add that your alibi doesn't exist. And now that they have fully ruled out that alibi, police want actual answers now. Now, Mark's interrogation was being led by Sergeant Kevin Baker and Sergeant Sean McDaniels. And at some point during the interrogation, Sergeant Baker momentarily steps out of the room for reasons that I do not know. At which point, Sergeant McDaniels says that Mark puts his head in his hands and asks him 2 chilling questions. Quote, is there such a thing as accidental death in South Carolina? End quote. And 2, quote, how do I explain getting rid of a body? End quote. To which Sergeant McDaniels stated, quote, if you did not get rid of a body, you would not ask that question. End quote. According to Sergeant McDaniels, he observed that Mark appeared to be, quote, struggling with telling the truth, end quote, but that he seemed to be on the verge of a full confession. However, when Sergeant Baker returned to the interrogation, Sergeant McDaniels attempted to update him on what Mark had just said, at which point Mark immediately shuts down and denies that he said anything, repeatedly saying, quote, I didn't say that, end quote. And this statement, or lack thereof, would become a major point of contention in the future, as it was not regular practice for police at this police department to record interrogations. Meaning, to this day, there is zero objective proof to whether or not Mark actually said this statement. Despite Mark's denial, investigators use the combination of these indirect admissions and witness accounts of gunshots being heard at Mark's home to finally establish probable cause. And Mark Richardson is officially arrested and charged with the murder of Shelton Sanders in October of 2005. The trial of Mark Richardson for the murder of Shelton Sanders started on April 14, 2008, at the Sumter County Courthouse in Sumter, South Carolina, almost 7 years since Shelton first went missing. Because investigators never recovered Shelton's remains or a definitive murder weapon, the prosecution was forced to argue a no body case built entirely on circumstantial evidence. The prosecution was led by Solicitor Barney Gies, with Sergeant Sean McDaniels as the lead investigator. The prosecution focused on establishing that Shelton was indeed deceased and that Mark Richardson had both opportunity and a suspicious motive. Now, a very important part of this case is actually proving that Shelton is indeed deceased. I know it may sound ridiculous or obvious, but under normal circumstances in a murder trial, you would have somebody like a medical examiner, like a pathologist, who would come in to prove that the victim was deceased. And that's just not possible in this case. So, to overcome the fact that Shelton's remains were never found, the prosecution presented evidence that Shelton had not contacted his family since he had been missing. He hadn't used his cell phone or accessed his bank accounts in 2,492 days at the time of the trial. But the prosecution did highlight the cell phone records they did have. Specifically, they focused on the cell tower records that showed Mark's phone pinging near the Greenbrier apartments, where Shelton's car was eventually found on the night that Shelton first went missing. The prosecution also called Mark's neighbor, a man named Robert Busby, who testified that on the night of the disappearance, he heard 3 gunshots come from the direction of Mark's home. And when he came out to check what was going on, was subsequently told by Mark, quote, "Don't worry about that. That was my car backfiring," end quote. The prosecution also called multiple friends of Mark and Shelton. And these friends testified that Mark had become increasingly paranoid and had reportedly told one of his friends that he was hearing voices in his head. And the voices were telling him to, quote, "get his friends before they got him," end quote. This is a suspicious motive that the prosecution was attempting to lay a groundwork for. They also called Shelton's family to the stand to talk about Mark's odd behavior when they started reaching out to him after Shelton first disappeared. Again, referring to Mark's demeanor as berserk, and even saying that he said some, quote, "very nasty," end quote, things to the family when they were reaching out to him. And finally, Sergeant McDaniels testified about Mark's previous interactions with investigators. He explained Mark's initial alibi of being with a lady of the night and its implausibility, and he also testifies about the 2 hypothetical questions that Mark allegedly asked Sergeant McDaniels during his interrogation, specifically focusing on, quote, "how do I explain getting rid of a body," end quote. But this would still be a point for the jury to decide, as because this interrogation was not recorded, it was essentially a matter of what Sergeant says versus what Mark says. It was then time for the defense's case. The defense, led by high-profile attorney I.S. Levy Johnson, focused on the lack of physical proof and the concept of reasonable doubt. And the defense very famously compared this case to a Burger King commercial, arguing, quote, "where's the beef," end quote, and that the state had, quote, "no beef," end quote, or in other words, no DNA, no blood, no fingerprints, and no forensic evidence of a crime. Now, if I were a jury member, would you, comparing a murder trial to Where's the Beef, have rubbed me the wrong way? Yes, it would have, because it rubs me the wrong way as I sit here right now. But he isn't trying to appeal to me, clearly. The defense also emphasized that the search of Mark's home did not yield any incriminating fluids or evidence, and that his car that was parked in the driveway wasn't even searched at all, and that the gun police did recover from the house wasn't even verified to be a murder weapon at all. And finally, they heavily criticized the Richland County Sheriff's Department for not recording this, quote, alleged hypothetical confession, end quote, that Mark supposedly gave, which, to give a mouse a cookie, I agree that was very bad policing. Mark Richardson elected not to testify in his own defense. And with that, the case goes back to the jury. And after a day of deliberation, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict in this case. And on April 22nd, 2008, the judge declared a mistrial. Reports indicate that the jury was split 8-4, with 8 jurors voting for guilty and 4 jurors voting for not guilty or undecided. And shortly after the mistrial is declared, Mark Richardson is released from jail. Because it was a mistrial and not an acquittal, Mark technically can be retried for this murder. but prosecutors have stated it is unlikely unless further evidence, such as Shelton's remains, is found. But very sadly, Shelton has not been seen for the last 25 years, and the case remains unsolved to this day. For over 25 years, Shelton's family has lived in what they have called, quote, heartbreaking limbo, end quote. But as an adult, Wilveria has become the lead advocate in his case. Quote, I have dedicated my entire life to my brother and giving him a voice. Our fight for Shelton is not over, end quote. She is responsible for launching the various Finding Shelton Sanders social media pages, erecting billboards across her state, and even attending CrimeCon to keep his story alive. And the family is offering a reward for any information leading to the discovery of Shelton's remains, and that reward has been increased to $150,000 as of June 2026. The Richland County Cold Case Unit remains active on the case, but their focus has shifted to locating Shelton's remains. As the family marks 25 years without Shelton, they have emphasized that they have already forgiven those who are involved. They simply want nothing more than to bring Shelton home and give him a proper burial. Shelton Sanders is remembered as a deeply inspiring and ambitious young man who was defined by his remarkable resilience and integrity, and known by those close to him for his humanity, patience, and unwavering truthfulness. He was a computer guru and a high achieving student just 6 months away from his college graduation at the time of his disappearance. And even when faced with the physical and emotional trauma of third-degree burns, Shelton demonstrated a remarkable spirit and a commitment to excellence. If you have any information, no matter how small you think it is, about the disappearance of Shelton Sanders, please contact the Richland County Sheriff's Department at 803-576-3000, or you can contact the dedicated tip line at 803-427-4290. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case. As always, please be respectful while discussing this case. And that concludes our story, everyone. I hope you have an incredible rest of your day. Please be sure to leave a like and comment down below anything you would like to comment down below. And be sure to subscribe or follow this podcast on your way out. It would really mean a lot to me. Again, thank you so much for listening. Never underestimate the power of your voice, and I'll see you all in my next episode. Bye.